Welcome to The Explainer. We often think of huge historical events, like World War II, as being driven by big, obvious forces. But what if I told you that a small, dedicated group, working behind the scenes, played a massive role in pushing America toward that very war? That's the story we're getting into today.
So before we really dive in, let's just pause on this question for a second. Think about it. Could a special interest group really push a whole nation toward war? How much power can a handful of people, even well-connected ones, actually have? It's a pretty wild thought, and it's central to everything we're about to uncover.
All right, so to really get what happened in the build-up to Pearl Harbor, you've got to meet the cast of characters, the unseen architects, you might say, who are working day and night to change America's direction.
So who are we talking about? The China lobby. And listen, this was no casual group of concerned citizens. This was a super-organized, very strategic operation. You had guys like Harry Price leading the charge, and he even managed to get Henry Stimson, a huge name, one of the most respected men in America at the time, to be their honorary chairman. Their goal? It was laser-focused. Get the U.S. to fully support China's leader, Chiang Kai-shek, against Japan. Simple as that.
And this is where things get really interesting because Washington was basically split into different camps. You can see the battle lines drawn right here. In one corner, you've got the China lobby and their heavy-hitting allies, like Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. They're all in, pushing for intervention, pushing for an embargo. But in the other corner, you have President Roosevelt himself and his Secretary of State, Cordell. And they're thinking, whoa, hold on. If we cut off Japan's oil, we could be starting a massive, catastrophic war. They wanted to avoid that at all costs.
Now, the lobby was smart. They knew they couldn't just strong-arm politicians in D.C. No, their first big move had to be winning over the American public. They needed to get the people on their side.
And man, their strategy was something else. It was a full-court press. They had a non-stop PR machine pumping out press releases that got picked up everywhere. They even used churches and other religious groups to spread their message. And one of their most brilliant moves? They convinced the public that a total oil embargo on Japan would be, get this, reprisal-free. Like, don't worry, they won't do anything back. And their reach, it went all the way to the top. They even had allies inside FDR's administration and got support from the president's own family. His mom and his wife, Eleanor, were both involved in China aid committees. Talk about influence.
Okay, so with all this momentum building, it was only a matter of time before it came to a head. And the big showdown inside the Roosevelt administration? Well, it all came down to one thing: money.
$35 million. That's the number right there. This was the lobby's first tangible, real-world win. It was a proposed loan to China, and this single proposal was about to tear the president's cabinet apart.
So the cabinet is completely divided. On one side, you have Treasury Secretary Morgenthau, who's passionately arguing that the U.S. has to act, that it's a moral imperative to support China. But on the other side, Secretary of State Hall is digging in his heels. He's saying, no way. Chiang Kai-shek is corrupt. His government is a mess, and we can't just throw American money at it.
And this wasn't some polite disagreement, It got super heated. Morgenthau was just so frustrated with the State Department's caution that he basically accused Secretary Hall of appeasing Japan. He said Hall had a policy of doing nothing which could possibly be objected to by an aggressor nation. Ouch. Those are fighting words in Washington.
So what does Morgenthau do? He pulls a seriously bold move. He waits until he knows his rival, Secretary Hall, is literally at sea on a boat, completely out of touch. Then he schedules a meeting with FDR and gets the president to approve the loan right then and there. By the time Hull gets back and finds out what happened, 4 days later, it's already a done deal. The China lobby, through their ally, had just won a huge victory.
But look, this win wasn't just about the cash. It was bigger than that. It completely changed the political game in D.C. and started to trap President Roosevelt himself. Here's the trap FDR found himself in. It's the 1940 election, and his opponent, Wendell Willkie, is hammering him, saying, if you re-elect Roosevelt, you're voting for war. And it was working. So to prove he wasn't a warmonger, FDR does something that seems smart on the surface. He brings two high-profile pro-war Republicans into his cabinet, Stimson and Knox. The idea was to create a unity government, but what he actually did was create a war cabinet where now pretty much everyone was pushing for war, boxing him in from all sides. You can feel the pressure mounting on FDR, right? So he makes another big calculated move. He orders the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet to move from its base in California all the way out to Hawaii. In his mind, this was a power play, a giant, unmistakable sign to Japan that said, don't even think about it, back off.
But here's the thing about signals. They can get misread. And boy, was this one misread. The Japanese military, and especially Admiral Yamamoto, didn't see a deterrent. They saw a target. His logic was chillingly simple. Well, if their fleet is close enough to hit us, then we're close enough to hit them too. What was meant to be a warning was seen as an invitation.
So, tensions are through the roof, signals are getting crossed everywhere, it's a mess. In the spring of 1941, there's one last desperate attempt at diplomacy, secret talks. But as you'll see, the whole thing was doomed from the start.
So Secretary Hull starts meeting in secret with the Japanese ambassador. But it was just a disaster. The two men could barely understand each other, not just because of language, but because their whole worldview was different. They were basically guessing what the other person meant. And this leads to an absolutely critical misunderstanding, where the ambassador leaves a meeting thinking Hull agreed to a key proposal that he had, in fact, completely rejected. The talks didn't just fail, they actually made things worse.
All right, so let's step back for a second and look at the big picture. What was the real lasting impact of this whole campaign by the China lobby?
Well, it's pretty staggering when you lay it all out. They completely changed public opinion in the U.S., they outmaneuvered the State Department to get money for China, they helped create a pro-war cabinet that left President Roosevelt with almost no room to move, and maybe most importantly, they poisoned the well so badly that real diplomacy with Japan became impossible. At the end of the day, they systematically shut down every off-ramp to peace, making a collision seem not just possible but inevitable.
And all of this leaves us with a really big question to chew on, doesn't it? It makes you wonder how much of history, the history we think we know, was actually written by the people behind the scenes, by the ones whose names don't always make it into the textbooks, working away, quietly shaping the world.